next presentation of Dr. Gert Demmink, which is a lawyer, auditor, and advisor of the Safe Trade Corridors, a hope-based firm developing algorithms and automated solutions for dual use of food screening. It's also an advisor to the enforcement function of the Central Bank of the UAE and interim judge in the Amsterdam Court. So I invite Gert to join the session here.
Yep. And good evening to all. Thank you to all the hosts and to our co-panelists and the previous speakers. Indeed, I'll share my screen.
Yes, please. Yes,
and
confirm that the screen is shared. Do you want to make it full screen with the
It's okay like this?
Okay, it's fine anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. We have just been talking about money laundering, and my very short presentation will touch upon money laundering, but from a different perspective. My presentation is not about the technology to perpetrate crime, but actually it's about technology itself. And the technology itself is the object of crime, and technology is also available to curb let's say the criminal actors and the criminal practices. When I say technology, there's a lot of technology available in the world, even bad technology. And what I'm going to speak about is military technology and what they call dual-use technology. Military technology is specially designed for military use, and dual-use technology was designed for civil use, but may also have a military application. And this technology, this world of technology and development and exports of technology and manufacturing of goods is governed by a different set of rules that are like Wassenaar Arrangement, the Chemical Weapons Convention, Nuclear Arms Treaty. And in the US, these are governed by the Export Administration Act and the Arms Export Control Act. And they have and in the EU we have a Council common position on military goods and a EU regulation on dual-use goods. And all of these things have, let's say, one thing in common. They deal with very comprehensive lists of technology, ranging from various categories, from aerospace propulsion, from marine and naval technology, computers and chemicals and what have you. And what we're looking at is a connection in the laws and regulations, predominantly in the US, and we'll touch upon that briefly, but also in other countries. Anybody who's exporting technology illegally, without consent or without an export license or an export permit, is actually making profit from an illegal or criminal act. And I would say that would constitute a money laundering offense. Now, if we look at what the US have done, and the Patriot Act, I think, well known with many of us after 9/11 has come about. They actually say that goods that are included in the Export Administration Regulation, being dual-use goods, if they are exported illegally, this may constitute a predicate offense in the framework of the fight against money laundering, because they're deemed to fall under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, under, of course, the certain condition that payment has taken place partly or wholly in the US. Now, we are always inclined to think that if there's a payment related to the US, there's US nexus, as we call it. And the US nexus would constitute US jurisdiction. But that's also the case when the goods are US technology. and that jurisdiction will follow that technology throughout the world. So the US have long-arm jurisdiction, as we know, and they are a very staunch and very serious enforcer. Now, what we're looking at is, if we're looking at dual-use goods, there's an analogy with, let's say, the money laundering or the anti-money laundering and counter of terrorism financing framework. Whereas in AML, we're looking at customer due diligence, we're looking at transaction monitoring. In the world of technology, we're looking at transaction due diligence, and we're looking at end-use verification and end-use monitoring. But these do come together. Goods must be checked, not only by, let's say, technology developers, universities, laboratoria, by manufacturers, by freight forwarders, by the shippers, but also by banks. Banks must know what's the nature of the goods they're financing, they're trading, they're making payments for, processing payments. And this is something that has a bearing indeed between the whole supply chain, let's say from university, from laboratoria, from technology development to the end user. And banks play a part in that whole game. I think almost a decade ago in Dubai at the conference, we did a poll and asked all the bankers if they wanted to know what the nature of the goods was they were trading and financing. And whereas, you know, old-fashioned bankers would say they trade in documents, more modern bankers say, no, we trade in goods because we finance them and we should take responsibility for, let's say, proliferation of certain technology and combating that proliferation. So actually what we're looking at is all these dual-use goods, they have classifications, they're categorized under certain categories under the Wassenaar arrangement and various lists. And all of these goods, of course, also have harmonized scheme custom codes or tariff codes. What banks are looking at and all others is actually a whole supply chain. And that supply chain is something they're part of themselves as well. So if we're looking at that supply chain, and it was said earlier today, we should have a good understanding of a certain goods life cycle across that whole supply chain. And this is always dubbed by the famous 4 Ws. What is it? Where is it coming from? Where is it going to? And why? With which purpose? And like always in many compliance departments, we have the proverbial Chinese army working on compliance issues, on sanctions, on transaction monitoring, especially on customer due diligence and enhanced due diligence. And we also have proverbial Chinese armies working in trying to find out whether or not a certain good or technology is indeed dual use or military. And it's a very costly affair, and it may stop the supply chain for months, asking for legal advice, going back to the shipper, going back to the authorities. And there are solutions, like for ERP, enterprise resource planning solutions by AEB from Germany and previous other ones as well, that will indeed help you understand whether or not a transaction can take place within the industry itself, within the production plant or the factory, and that it can leave that plant indeed with a license authorized, or let's say an export authorization. But since all goods have an HS code from a customs perspective, we are looking at and building a solution that understands indeed how these HS codes will correlate with certain export control classification numbers or export control classification numbers in determining the dual use nature of that particular good involved in a transaction. This is not easy, and we use technology. And that technology indeed is looking at artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the distributed ledger. And what we're looking at indeed is trying to understand, if we're looking at the supply chain, we should have a distributed ledger where all parties involved in the supply chain and the finance can have one single truth, unaltered, and learn, let's say, from previous transactions. We're in a nascent state, so to speak, and we're working with a large airline currently on a user acceptance test and see how that may work for them, and understand indeed that as a freight forwarder, they have a responsibility indeed to understand as well. Banks take an interest in a solution because it would help them, because once the dual use nature and the precise categorization has been determined, they may use that one as well. It will help us in industry and in society to get a better understanding indeed through modern technology to curb the proliferation of, let's say, protected technology. And it will help us indeed to fight the financing of proliferation and proliferation of certain technology itself. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. I really enjoy it, in particular because this is my field of research. I'm based in Dubai, by the way. You are there. Sometimes you can be.
We're neighbors, Alessio.
Yeah, and I'm developing an API for implementing the journal entry accounting to have real-time audits of all the transactions that might have integrated with the ERPs that you mentioned. So let's get in touch. Okay.
Yes, we should.
We'll shift immediately to the next session because we are running out of time, unfortunately.